in tonight's special firing line debate. We come to you tonight from Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. At Seton Hall, as at all institutions of higher learning, the issue of Mr. Buckley's parentage has been the subject of lively speculation for decades now. But our official debate topic actually raises that issue only indirectly. The official wording is, resolved, the evolutionists should acknowledge creation. Now those last two words, acknowledge creation, require some parsing. The word creation is shorthand for the proposition that humankind was created by God in his own image, as it says in the Bible. Some creationists believe the theory of evolution is simply wrong, while others believe that the theories of evolution and creation are compatible. The word acknowledge here can mean a couple of things as well. It could mean that evolutionists should accept the truth of creation theory. Or it just may mean that the theory of creationism is entitled to be treated as an open question, especially in the teaching of biology in high school. We shall see which of these interpretations tonight's debaters have in mind. The theory of evolution was first enunciated, of course, by Charles Darwin almost a century and a half ago in his book, The Origin of the Species. In recent years, Darwin's proposition has been subject to two opposite trends. On the one hand, there has been explosive growth in a field called evolutionary psychology, which applies the theory of evolution not just to physical attributes, but to a wide assortment of human behavior. Your decision to come to this debate tonight in this auditorium was dictated by pressures on our shared human ancestors generations ago. That's only a slight exaggeration of what the evolutionary psychologists believe. On the other hand, religious groups have had growing success in requiring creationism to be taught alongside evolutionary theory in the nation's schools. Just last month, the National Association of Biology Teachers dropped two key words from its official statement on teaching evolution. The statement used to read, "The diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process." Those words, unsupervised and impersonal, are now gone. Is the teaching of evolution another example of political correctness, where dissident views are being censored? Or are the creationists trying to pass off theology as science? That's more or less the debate. Let's welcome tonight's debaters. The team is... To begin, I call on Mr. Buckley to propose tonight's motion. Mr. Buckley.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I retreat from any formulation of tonight's exchange that suggests that everyone on the other side should embrace creation. Not everyone on the affirmative side embraces creation. What we contend is that everyone should acknowledge creation as an alternative explanation for cosmic and biological happenings now thought by so many as naturalist in provenance and momentum. Why? Because my colleagues and I judge that the evidence for the naturalist theory of evolution is not merely insubstantial, it is fanciful. If it is so that life as we know it is the ongoing display of punctuated equilibriums, then we pause and ask, what is the theory of natural selection, and how explain macroevolutionary developments? If there is no theory, on the grounds that you don't need a theory to account for mere happenstance, then we give it as our judgment that such data as we have can't come up with a plausible theory under the aegis of natural materialism, because what pops up here is chaotic, there contradictory. If chance is the progenitor of the human eye, then chance is so arresting in its stochastic formulations as to warrant something other than scientific complacency, something more like true reverence. But reverence is a swear word in buttoned-down scientific circles because it sounds too extra natural. We don't revere the aurora borealis, we simply take pleasure in it, as we do in the Goldberg variations, happy that the cosmos happened to give us that stupendous constellation, happy that the genetic pool gave us the art of Johann Sebastian Bach. I speak only for myself, though some of my confederates may wish to associate themselves with me on this matter, when I say that I am much taken by what goes by the name of the anthropic view. What it says is that there are a handful of elements that make up the cosmos, and that the balance in which they coexist has no explanation more plausible than that there's only then that's the only way to make possible a human life. Whence anthropic design for man. The nuclear weak force island formed is 10 to the 20th times the strength of gravity. If it had been just a little weaker, the Earth would have been without water. Uniquely among the molecules, water is lighter in its solid than in its liquid form. Ice therefore floats. If it weren't so, the ocean would freeze from the bottom up, and the Earth would be covered with solid ice. Such data aren't the kind of things that make up my personal library. But how much science do we need to master to qualify us reasonably to affirm that there has to be a reason for you and me and the world we live in? A reason other than acts of raw nature driven by what? I'm reminded of the reply by an elderly scientist 100 years ago when confronted by an exuberant young skeptic. He said to his student, I gotta tell you, I find it more reasonable to believe in God than to believe that Hamlet was deduced from the molecular structure of a mutton chop. So I beg your attention to our resolution tonight, which is that the dogma of evolution should give way to a broader intelligence which makes way for a first mover. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. Very Lynn to oppose tonight's motion. Mr. Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The French philosopher René Descartes wrote, I think, therefore I am. Although I am neither French nor a philosopher, I say I have somehow ended up once again on the set of firing line, therefore I must have been created somehow. In fact, none of us on this team have any doubt that we have all been created somehow. Where we disagree with Mr. Buckley and his colleagues is on the relationship between evolution and our current situation. On this team, we differ on our answers to some of these great and literally cosmic questions. Is there a God? Is there purpose in the universe? But we all agree that evolution is indeed the only logically coherent and useful explanation for the development of life. Evolution is an explanation of a natural process. It is not an ideology, and nor, Mr. Buckley, is it at all fanciful. Like the theory of gravity or the theory of electromagnetism, evolutionary theory continues to be refined year by year and month by month. Yet in each case, there has been no fundamental challenge that has been made to any of these scientific doctrines since they were developed. Tonight, you will hear claims asserting fundamental scientific flaws in the notion of evolution. We'll examine such assertions and try to show how those are themselves illogical. More importantly, though, we'll demonstrate that the arguments made by the other side are based on fundamentalist religious beliefs or discredited philosophical constructs, or what we sometimes refer to as just plain nonsense. We can't afford, ladies and gentlemen, for this to become too abstract a debate, because creation science advocates from California to Alabama have already duped school boards and thus required school children to believe that evolution can somehow be debunked by alternative theories. In so doing, schools are being asked to elevate pseudoscience to the level of genuine science. What's next? Will we find the casting of astrological charts replacing telescope observations in high schools? I hope not, but I think that's the direction we might end up going. And indeed, if our children are not as prepared as those in Japan and Europe to understand what science is, to recognize the difference between a scientific question and a religious question, then they frankly will not be able to compete in the extraordinarily well-developing world of the future. Now, there is that ever so slim possibility that in the next 2 hours we may not put to rest conclusively the debate over evolution and creation. But I hope our team does make you consider the implications of this debate, that you're persuaded at a minimum that speculation is much less useful than rigorous scientific analysis, and also that you can even choose to be faithful to theism, to a belief in God, and still accept the biological theory of evolution for what it is. Finally, we're going to insist that Mr. Buckley's team that doesn't believe that evolution is viable, explain then what in the world did happen to bring us to Seton Hall University tonight. As Martin Gardner once put it, if you claim the world is not round, you are obliged to tell us what shape you think it really is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Ms. Scott, and Professor Johnson will make an opening statement.
The issue before the House is essentially simple. Evolutionary science takes its starting point from a philosophical position known as naturalism or materialism. Evolutionary scientists assume that nature's all there is and that nature is composed of material entities, the particles that physicists study. It follows, logically, that science must and can explain the origin of complex living organisms solely by natural causes, meaning unintelligent causes. God may not create directly, nor may God direct evolution, because God is an intelligent being and evolution is by definition a mindless process. And yet, even according to the leading Darwinist Richard Dawkins, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Is it possible that they appear that way because they actually were designed and there really is a designer? Evolutionary biologists emphatically answer no, not because of the evidence, but because their philosophy effectively excludes that designer from reality. They insist against the evidence that unguided chemical processes can produce living organisms from non-living chemicals, and that a combination of random mutations and natural selection can, given enough time, produce complex plants and animals from single-celled ancestors through a mindless process. These far-reaching claims, loaded with religious implications, are not supported by the scientific evidence. My colleagues and I want to separate the real science from the materialist philosophy that provides the only real support for this Darwinist theory.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. An opening statement from Ms. Scott.
Now, hearing Phil define evolution is a little bit like having Madalyn Murray O'Hair define Christianity. Let me define evolution the way scientists define evolution, the way we're going to use it on our side of the table. Evolution is used two ways. One is a bigger idea that the present is different from the past, that the universe has had a history, that stars, galaxies, the planet Earth, plants and animals on it have changed through time. Biological evolution is a subset of the idea of change through time, saying that living things, plants and animals, have shared common ancestors and have descended with modification from those ancestors. Now notice in this definition, I talked about what happened. I didn't talk about who done it, and I didn't talk about how, because those are separate issues. Scientists are very much united on what happened. Evolution happened, to modify a bumper sticker. But how it happened is something that we argue about a lot in science. How important is natural selection? How important are other mechanisms? Whodunit is something that as scientists we can't comment on as scientists. We can put on our philosopher's hat and comment as individuals, but as scientists we can't deal with ultimate cause. So I think we have to be very clear about what we mean by evolution. What they mean by evolution is some sort of a metaphysical system that we do not recognize.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. You have 5 minutes to question Ms. Scott.
Yes, do you say that Darwinian evolution does not have a profound religious implication of discouraging belief that there is an intelligent creator who brought about our existence for a purpose?
I think that to some people, yes, natural selection, Darwinism is evolution through natural selection, does cause problems. If your theology requires you to interpret the Bible literally, 6 24-hour days, 10,000 years ago, and so forth, you're going to have a problem.
But only for biblical literalists, not for the proposition that I asked about, which is that a creator brought about our existence for a purpose.
I don't think so in the broader sense, because, for example, there was a survey done not too long ago of American men and women of science, and one of the questions that they asked was something on the order of evolution occur. Human beings evolved, but God directed the process. 40% of scientists agreed with that, which is the same as the general public. So clearly the idea of evolution can't be totally negative.
We don't know whether they were evolutionary biologists, do we? They weren't. We weren't talking about Richard Dawkins, Stephen Jay Gould, and Richard Lewontin in that poll, are we?
There are evolutionary biologists who have made something of a philosophical statement out of evolution. You and I both agree with that. But I think you have to be careful about not tarring all evolutionary biologists with that brush.
Let's get to that statement. Are you familiar with this kind of a symbol? A fish here that says Jesus in it, you see it on cars. And then you're familiar with this one,
I am
too.
indeed.
And is it your view that the relationship, the resemblance between these two is not coincidental?
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
This is what we call evidence of intelligent design.
You might consider it an evolution of the fish, but...
Yes, now, so in fact, this is put on to mock the Christian fish symbol, isn't it? With Darwin there right in the place of Jesus.
I suspect some people consider it a form of mockery. I have also, driving around Berkeley, I don't know how unusual Berkeley is from other cities in the country, but I have seen the Darwin fish and the Christian fish facing each other on bumpers. So obviously not everybody,
well,
it's a rather ecumenical car there, I think.
I notice here I have a letter from the National Centers for Science Education signed by you, and I notice Professor Ruse and Professor Miller are on the letterhead. And it says, your letter says, quite a few NCSE members sport the Darwin fish on their cars, and for a $50 donation, I'd be delighted to send you something new, a sturdy Darwin fish refrigerator magnet, also good for keeping things in your filing cabinet. So you've rather thought that would have quite an appeal to the members of your organization, didn't you?
I sort of wish I was Jerry Brown and I could hold up an 800 number here so that you could all call and donate to the National Center for Science Education. But yeah, a lot of our members are people who are very concerned about the teaching of evolution in the public schools. So therefore, they find the Darwin fish attractive. You'll notice, as a member of NCSE and somebody who receives our newsletter, we don't advertise it in the newsletter. We don't make a big point of sort of trying to sell it. Because some people are offended by it. We're not in the business of offending Christians.
Now, you are aware, and I think you're quite willing to agree with me on this, that whatever may be the ultimate truth of this, many people do use Darwinian evolution as an argument for atheism.
Correct.
And in fact, the impression is widely around that this is done with the approval, tacit approval at least, of the scientific establishment. Richard Dawkins goes around the world arguing this without being criticized by authoritative sources. And Carl Sagan, who did that famous Cosmos series saying the cosmos is all there is or ever was or ever will be, was honored with the Public Welfare Medal by the National Academy of Sciences. So there is some reason for people to think this, and I think your participation in changing the National Association of Biology teachers' statement also indicated that. Now,
wait a minute. The statement was changed in a way that you
Yes, I understand that, but I mean that there was some reason for concern in the prior version of the statement.
Absolutely.
Yes, I was just trying to agree with you here. Now, I'm trying to help you with this credibility problem. And what I wonder is, wouldn't it be a good idea at this point if the National Academy of Sciences, which so vigorously addressed these issues when it was fighting the legal battle against creation science, took the issue up again? And developed a panel. The last time they appointed 7 scientists and 4 lawyers to this panel, so Mr. Lynn and I could both be there, to address the question of what is the message they want to send the public. Do they want to send the public the message that evolution is an unsupervised, unintelligent, impersonal process? Do they want to send a message that is so effectively used for promotion of atheistic materialism, or do they want to criticize that as non-science? Wouldn't it be a good idea?
You can answer that question.
Yes, wouldn't it be a good idea
there
to
have
take
been
that
9
up?
questions.
Would you agree with me that they should take it up?
Well, I said there are things you said that I agree with and things you said that I don't agree with. Let's start with the places where we agree. I agree that many scientists have been very sloppy about how they use terms like natural selection, purpose, etc. And I, for one, as Phil has kindly pointed out, have criticized this. I've criticized Dawkins. Many other scientists have it all. I am not a believer. I would agree philosophically with Richard Dawkins, but I don't think that he should be confusing his philosophical views with science. He shouldn't be passing his philosophical views about materialism off as if they're inevitably arising from evolution. So I think that in order to encourage you, I think we are going to see more things like the NABT statement. We're going to see more recognition on the part of the science and education communities that indeed we have to be more careful with how we use terms. And I accept that.
You can now
the good news is that the National Academy of Science is rewriting the Science and Creationism booklet. And I'm on the committee that's advising that.
Yes, I know. It's very one-sided movement.
Well, one-sided in the sense we're all in favor of teaching of evolution. That doesn't sound too strange.
Take this opportunity to ask some questions.
In my reading of your materials, Phil, I see that you have argued three things. Evolution, which I have just defined as descent with modification, doesn't happen. A second thing that you argue is that Darwinism, which is natural selection, evolution by natural selection, natural selection is not a powerful enough mechanism to produce descent with modification. A third thing I see in your writings is that science, and especially evolution, is inherently a metaphysical belief system. Now, lawyers are used to hypothetical questions, so if you don't mind my asking you a hypothetical question.
Don't mind at all.
If you could wave a wand over this audience and make everyone here in this audience agree with one of those points, which is your most important one? What really grabs you?
There's no doubt about what the key point is. By the way, of course, I don't deny that there is such a thing as descent with modification. The question is how much it explains, is descent. But the key question, and the only really important one from a philosophical and cultural standpoint, is the mechanism. Can you make those things that look as if they were designed for a purpose, those extremely complicated, irreducibly complex biological organisms, through a mindless material process, specifically the accumulation of micromutations through natural selection? The mechanism is the big issue.
Number two, in other words. If I could follow up with that, are you aware of the arguments that are going on in evolutionary biology today in which the role of natural selection is debated? There already is quite a conversation going on as to how much natural selection explains. What about the other mechanisms that are suggested to produce evolutionary change?
There aren't really any other mechanisms. That's why natural selection remains, and you can see this whenever the criticism comes up. It's very effective criticism from Stephen Jay Gould and others, but there is no alternative to do the adaptation building process, and Gould himself says that in his recent article, Darwinian Fundamentalism.
But even you agree that natural selection is adequate for producing microevolutionary processes.
Well, microevolution is misnamed. Natural selection, as in for example, the finch-beak variation example, brings out the variation already present in the gene pool in a fundamentally stable population. It doesn't create anything.
How about explaining that?
Yes, finch-beaks, in a population of birds on an island, finch-beaks are a little larger sometimes, a little smaller sometimes. On the average, the population is essentially stable. It isn't going anywhere and isn't changing into anything.
What is your unit of change that microevolution applies to?
The question
What is a kind, in other words?
The question is the source of genetic information. An organism is much more complex than a computer program or a spaceship. What is the origin of that information? When you've got a gene pool with all that information in it, it can vary within limits.
I'm sorry, Phil, I didn't make my question clear. You talk about species of finch on an island and the amount of genetic variability in that species, and your argument, I think, is you just get change within the kind. What is a kind? I mean, so if dogs are a kind, are wolves part of that kind? If dogs and wolves are part of the kind, are coyotes part of the kind? What's the limit of genetic variability? What's the group? What's the unit that you're talking about in which microevolution can take place?
Yes, I don't think we know precisely what the limits of variation are. With domestic animal breeding, you haven't been able even to get to speciation. But I think that there's good circumstantial evidence that there may have been wider change and development at some time in the past by mechanisms that aren't understood. What you clearly don't get is the classes, the phyla, the major groups, the major innovations in complex organs that way.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Darwin's theory of evolution is the last of the great 19th century mystery religions. And as we speak, it is now following Freudianism and Marxism into the nether regions. And I'm quite sure that Freud, Marx, and Darwin are commiserating one with the other in the dark dungeon where discarded gods gather. The problem facing us at the end of the 20th century, with a magnificent body of theoretical accomplishment in physics and mathematics, and a very rich body of descriptive material in biology, is to come to an understanding that when it comes to the large global issues that Darwin's theory is intended to address, we simply do not have a clue. This is a daunting admission to make, but if we're intellectually honest, we should make it. The mechanism that Darwin proposed, that of random search or a stochastic shuffle, is known to be inadequate in every domain in which it's applied. It's known to be inadequate in linguistics, and it's certainly inadequate when it comes to the overwhelming complexity of living forms. There is no reason on earth to believe that this mechanism is adequate to the task that it sets itself. If it should come to pass in the fullness of time that we discover that there is no explanation for life, we will have to accept it. If it should come to pass that we discover in the fullness of time that the only explanation for life is that it is a process designed for transcendental purposes by a transcendental figure, we will have to accept that too. And if that should come to pass, I would like to ask, who among us will genuinely feel diminished? Thank you.
Don't go away.
Don't go away.
Mr. Berlinsky, I do want to commend you for the rich description of biological systems and species in your commentary article. You claim that there are some species that have what you at one point referred to as weird characteristics that are nearly unique. For example, only a few plants eat insects or carnivorous. Why aren't all of them? You also ask, if evolution is true, quote, then why are women, but not cats, born without the sleek tails that would make them even more alluring than they already are? Well, now, aside from aesthetics, you know, I saw the Catwoman Batman film too, but aside from that, why? You don't seem to understand that different ecological environments in the distant past as well as today produce different adaptations. Why is that so strange to you?
You're right, I don't
you would
understand
find it as a failure of evolution?
You're right, I don't understand it.
You don't understand that different ecological spaces require different adaptability, that the same kind... You don't?
No.
Well, it seems fairly easy to figure out that if you're living in a desert,
that is the difficulty with the Darwinian
water
position.
would be
it's
more
always
important.
easy to persuade yourself that you've understood something when you haven't understood a thing. The issue before us is not whether retroactively we can explain an adaptation, but whether we can draw that adaptation from general principles. This is what Darwinian theory cannot do. And this is the requirement of normal science.
Well,
if I'm doing astrophysics, I have a dynamical theory. I can simulate the evolution of the universe, and I know where the theory agrees with the data and where it does not. I cannot do that in biology.
Well, then
Whatever
I think
happens,
with a
happens.
simple sentence you could. Random selections which make a species more likely to survive are beneficial. That's a very simple idea, and it explains why, in fact, some species survive and others do not.
I mean, adaptive differential reproduction is the definition of natural selection. Why is this
what
a
will
problem?
happen will happen.
What is this a
that
problem?
could not be the locus in which you repose your trust. What will happen will happen. Big deal.
No, that's not.
a
No,
theory.
adaptive differential reproduction is not what will happen.
That's just a large Latinate construction.
Let me ask another question.
Why don't you explain what that term means?
Well, I don't know. It may not necessarily enlighten our listeners, actually, because it is technical. But that's the whole point.
It's not technical.
I mean,
it just means what survives.
One of the reasons why people like me who deal with the creation evolution issue all the time get very frustrated dealing with, say, Institute for Creation Research people and so forth, is because they are constantly saying X didn't happen, and then it takes a great deal longer to explain why X did happen, gaps in the fossil record or whatever. Let me ask you a question about your commentary article.
Okay.
You said in your commentary article, page 20, the major transitional sequences in the fossil record are incomplete.
Yes, they are.
And you cited as your reference Romer's hot off the press 1966 article.
No.
Now, are you Romer? Romer is a very great man and very knowledgeable.
Yeah.
1966 is not exactly cutting-edge paleontology.
Right.
Are you familiar, sir?
Let's turn to Carol.
No. Are you familiar with the research that's been done in the last 31 years?
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine that, because you would realize that the major argument going on among paleontologists dealing with the reptile-mammal transition is, where the hell do you draw the line? these things grade insensibly into each other, and they have no ability to say, these guys are mammals, these guys are reptiles, because they roll into each other.
Yes, I agree with the tail end of your question. Late reptilian transition to mammal is well documented in the record, although nowhere near as well as Darwinian theory requires. That's a big distinction. But if you dislike the citation to Romer, who's a great figure in paleontology, let's look at Carroll's new book on chordate paleontology, hot off the presses, page 4, left side of the page, evolution heading, third paragraph, second sentence. What does he say? He says, the evidence shows that major transitions are missing from the fossil record, just as Eldridge, Gould, and Stanley
in reference to the chordates. Now, the fact that we don't have all the information...
That's the strongest case.
We don't have all the information... No, I was talking about the reptile-mammal transition. Chordates are very, very much earlier.
The problem is your argument is the chordates. Vertebrates, that's us.
No, chordates are the vertebrates belong to.
If you turn to the insects, the situation is catastrophic. There is no fossil documentation. None whatsoever. For the insects.
There's very good fossil documentation.
Very poor.
For the
Butterfly, Lepidoptera.
Between ants and wasps, there's excellent transition.
Yes, there are lateral transitions.
But we won't count that. Let's talk about the ones we don't have evidence
spiders, major insects groups, they simply appear.
Mr. Berlinsky, you're never going to be satisfied. Every time that you find 16 new things, new fossils, to fill in the so-called fossil record that was missing, you just say find 16 more. So my question to you is, how many 16 to the what power do we have to discover before
I'll tell you
accept
exactly.
this is true?
Here's what Darwinian theory rigorously requires. For every significant morphological or physiological feature in a modern species, we should have a panoply of intermediate forms that explains how they arise. We don't have them for some good reasons, but we have nothing like an explanation for the gaps that exist.
The fog is rolling in again.
I'm telling you, the species aren't there.
We were talking first of all about evolution, descent with modification. Now we've shifted over to mechanisms of evolution.
No, I haven't mentioned
mechanisms. And we're out
mechanisms.
of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Berlinsky. Professor Miller. Professor Miller, it's your chance to make an opening statement with more props.
Can't live without them. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed Dr. Berlinsky's statement, because he focused in on one of the major deficiencies of the four people on the other side of the table who argue against evolution. And that major theoretical deficiency is they have no explanation for natural history. And to me, as an experimental biologist, I am frustrated if I do not see a theoretical framework into which the past can be explained. We know something about the past, and there are facts about the fossil record, and I'll tell you in a very general way one of those facts, and that is that fossils show a succession of types over time. Now, we know the other side advocates intelligent design as a primary characteristic of the fossil record. Let's explore the primary scientific characteristic of intelligent design when it is squared with the fossil record. The fossil record, and I can give you specific examples, is characterized best by sequences of appearances and disappearances. Now think what that means. What that means is that the characteristic that best describes the intelligent designer who would have designed this fossil record is incompetence. Because everything the intelligent designer designed, with about 1% exceptions, has immediately become extinct. Intelligent design has no explanation for the successive character of the fossil record. Evolution has a perfect explanation, and that is the appearance of new forms and the extinction of others. And if you see a scheme for the natural history of intelligent design presented by the other side tonight, you should treasure it, because they've never announced one before.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Don't go away. Mr. Behe. Professor Johnson.
Is next. In my discussion with Eugenie, we talked about the mechanism as the all-important thing, and the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism as to produce all this genetic information.
Indeed.
What is the most powerful demonstration, in your opinion, that the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection has this great creative power?
Well, I would give you, you asked me for the most powerful one, and I will give you two. The first one that I will give you are the repeated observations of random mutation and natural selection, as you like to call them in your own terms, producing new species. And I can give you several examples of new species that have emerged within human observation. The best example that I can give you is a butterfly, a genus of butterfly known as Hedylipta. Hedylepta is a genus of butterfly that feeds on various plants. It's endemic to the Hawaiian Islands, which means it's only found there. And there turn out to be 2 species of Hedylepta with mouth parts that only allow them to feed on bananas. Now, why is that significant? It is significant because bananas are not native to the Hawaiian Islands. They were introduced about 1,000 years ago by the Polynesians. We know this from the written records of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And what that means is that by mutation and natural selection, these 2 species have emerged on the Hawaiian Islands within the last 1,000 years. And I think that's a very good case in point. And I'll give you another one if you would indulge me, but I figure you only asked for one. Want another?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, here's another. In the November 7th or November 14th issue of Science magazine, a number of investigators wanted to test the Darwinian hypothesis that you folks say is never tested. And the way in which they did this was to take the receptor protein for the human growth hormone. It's a receptor to which the human growth hormone fits in precisely, and they did it a terrible genetic disservice. They mutated, they cut out an essential amino acid right in the middle of the receptor called tryptophan. With that gone, just like that mousetrap, it wouldn't have been expected to work. They then allowed a natural selection process to take place to see whether the cells, under their own observation, could mutate the receptor gene sufficiently to bind the receptor, and after 7 generations, lo and behold, there it was. And it illustrates beautifully the ability of natural selection to respond to mutations in proteins to co-evolve.
Mr. Behe?
I'd like to ask a different question. I do not find that result impressive, but we can talk about that later.
When you say you don't find it impressive, that's what Richard Dawkins calls the argument from personal incredulity.
But you realize
which is my evidence. My evidence against evolution is that I don't believe it.
Well, it's because of course, what it has to do. It has to create this immense amount of genetic information, much
Indeed,
more
sir.
complex than any,
Phillip,
and
you're
without recording it in the fossil record.
Right.
That's
And you know
why
what,
it's
Phil?
not impressive.
I just gave you 2 examples, and that's still not enough.
May I ask another question related to Haeckel's embryos?
Oh, absolutely.
You not only showed these embryos in your book, but like other people, you said that things should be that way. You said in your book, mutations that affect early stage of development are likely to be lethal or deadly, and that mutations that cause less drastic changes would occur at later stages. Again, you're not alone in this. Bruce Alberts, who wrote Molecular Biology of the Cell, says much the same thing. Now we know that is not the case, and that early embryos can in fact change. Because you and Bruce Alberts, the president of the National Academy of Sciences...
Is there a question?
Yes, here it is. Because you two did not, because you thought Darwinism would produce this result, which is now shown to be fraudulent, is it safe to say that no scientist in the world understands how Darwinism could affect embryology?
Oh, absolutely not. May I answer even though we're out of time?
Very briefly.
Okay, very brief answer is, you read a quote and you pretended it meant something else. The quote that you read was, mutations in the early stage are less likely to survive, not impossible, and then you pretended to say that it meant that they couldn't survive. The fact that something is less likely, the fact that something is less likely, the fact that something, I'm answering, the fact that something is less likely does not rule it out. I agree with that, Alberts would agree with that, and I think everyone in the audience would agree with it too.
Thank you.
Along those lines, because you bring up your faith, and I have to tell you that over the weekend, looking for a weakness, I read Nearer My God, your recent book, which I much admired. I thought it was a marvelous explanation of the faith that you and I share. And I want to read a quotation to you, and as everyone in the audience will know, I came tonight with the hope to be remembered as the guy with the placards. And the quotation is an important one. New knowledge has led to the recognition of more than a hypothesis in the theory of evolution. It is indeed remarkable that this theory has been progressively accepted by researchers following a series of discoveries in various fields of knowledge. The convergence, neither sought nor fabricated, of the results of work that was conducted independently, is in itself a significant argument in favor of this theory. Would you care to speculate who said that, sir?
Well, the answer is I have no quarrel with it. Within 10 years after Darwin died, they were able to document to a point that he hadn't in the 20 years since he had visited Galapagos, a certain phenomena. I have no quarrel with those phenomena. But I think it's correct to classify them as microevolutionary, not macroevolutionary.
Well, in that point, I think you're in disagreement with Pope John Paul II, who made that statement.
No, wait a minute. Pope John Paul II said that he could not countenance any explanation which sought to account for the forces of living matter other than as mere epiphenomena of the matter, and are therefore incompatible with the truth about man.
And as a Catholic, I agree completely with that. And also as an evolutionary biologist, I accept evolution as the scientific explanation for life's diversity.
Thank you. Thank you. You're dismissed.
Mr. Johnson, your career seems built on picking alleged fleas off of the dog of evolution, but when it comes down to picking the fleas off, you find they're just pieces of lint, not really serious problem for the dog. But you never seem to want to discuss your dog. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about religion. To talk about Noah's Ark, for example. Do you believe that there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark, at least baby dinosaurs? Or
I don't make any reference to the Bible or biblical authority. I don't deal with that at all, and I really don't have an opinion about it.
You don't have an opinion. Okay, well, let's say that this book, which is widely distributed in creationist circles and used in schools, home schools, and religious schools at this point, has
nothing to do with me.
Well, I'm going to ask you about why you don't do something that those of us on this side do. Here's a little picture, man and a dinosaur. Adam wasn't scared to watch dinosaurs eat because all the creatures ate plants and not meat. Now, do you think that's good biology, number one?
I do not. And in fact, I have said on many occasions and have urged persons of the conservative Christian community to put aside the whole Bible issues and let us ask the question, what is actually known from scientific evidence as opposed to materialist philosophy about the claims of evolution?
You're a great lawyer, but you didn't answer the question. I want you to know, to tell us if you think that this is not so silly and dangerous kind of ideas to plant in the hands of high school students that in fact the Flintstones are some kind of documentaries.
Yeah.
That's pretty dangerous.
Yeah. The kind of thing, I haven't seen this, the kind of thing you're encouraging certainly is silly, just almost as silly as the work of Richard Dawkins.
All right.
And is damaging.
Professor Miller.
And I mean that, you see, and the work of those who say that material processes can explain the entire living world.
Go ahead, Ms. Scott.
No, that's all right.
Okay, I'm sure it will surprise no one. I have one more chart. And we have heard over and over again that there are gaps in the fossil record, there are missing forms, and it's been implied the only reason they could be there is because evolution is not the explanation. I want to show you a very famous gap. It's a gap between mesonekid mammals, land-dwelling carnivores that lived, 55, 60 million years ago, and archaeocetes, which are the oldest whales. We know from skull and dentition patterns that, as it turns out, these whales are very closely related to mesonekeds. And my colleague directly across from me, Michael Behe, once wrote, if random evolution is true, there must be a large number of transitional forms between mesonekid and the ancient whale, and much in the way that Dr. Berlinsky has said, he said, where are they? Well, they're right here. 2, 3. There turn out to be 3 transitional forms, including a complete skeleton named Ambulocetus natans, which turns out to be an extraordinary intermediate. And here's the point that I want to ask you. It turns out that all these fossils are found in the area where the Indus River empties into the Indian Ocean. They're all in the right sequence, and furthermore, they form a transitional series. Now, here's what I want to know, Phil. You keep saying, where are the transitional forms? Paleontologists dig them up. What's the matter with them?
Here's what the matter is. The most important point to me is that the fossil record is most conclusively un-Darwinian just where it's most complete, in marine invertebrates. And that is why it is shocking that one finds that where it's the most incomplete and where the imagination can have free play, that's where you get the examples. We don't know that these form a transitional sequence at all, and you don't know how it could have happened and by what mechanism. And if you do, I wish you'd publish the paper on it, because I'd love to see it torn to bits.
Hang on for a second. I don't want anyone to miss the point. Dr. Behe said, where's the transition? Phillip Gingrich and others dug up not one, not two, but 3 transitionals.
Are they transitionals? We don't know that.
You know, I would think in a fair fight, you'd say, you know, darn it, we were wrong on that one. You guys got the evidence. Okay, here's one for your side. But what's happening is...
I can quote to you from an article in Science says that they are not. Cannot be placed in an ancestor descendant to sequence.
No. Well, we're going to have to miss it. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm done.
Professor. You're done. You're free. Thank you very much.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Miss Scott, it's your turn. And who would like to begin the questioning? Mr. Berlinsky.
Dr. Scott,
all right, go ahead.
Dr.
You're champion.
I asked the captain. He said okay. In the recent fundraising letter of National Center for Science Education, you state that when the ACLU wants to know what's this intelligent design stuff, we're there to inform them that it is indeed a religiously based alternative to evolution, completely outside of science. Okay, now let me give you a quote from an astronomer named Fred Hoyle, who discovered things called resonance energy levels for carbon, oxygen, and helium, and found that they are arranged exactly as they must be to support life. Hoyle wrote, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." I have 2 questions. How is his concluding intelligent design from the facts of astronomy different from concluding intelligent design from the facts of, say, the bacterial flagellum? And second, are you going to sic the ACLU on Fred Hoyle?
Fred Hoyle is a distinguished astronomer, as you pointed out. When he speaks about biological phenomena, I would not say that he speaks ex cathedra.
He was speaking.
As a matter of fact, one of the statements that Fred Hoyle made with Chandra Wickramasinghe is that actually insects are smarter than we think they are, but they're just not letting us know.
He was speaking about astronomy in his quotation.
He has rather strange views about evolution, and I would not consider him an authority.
But he's concluding intelligent design from astronomy.
Mr. Berlinsky.
Dr. Scott, I find myself vexed by your cavalier attitude toward the evidence, especially with respect to the fossil record, and that's the only evidence that your side has presented with great vigor. Would you agree, as almost everyone else affirms, that the overwhelming pattern of the fossil record is sharply discontinuous?
Is what, I'm sorry?
Sharply discontinuous.
Sure, it's discontinuous.
Okay, so we agree on that. Could I ask you to give us your best estimate of the number of changes required to take a dog-like mammal to a seagoing whale?
Can we, first of all, distinguish, which was confused, I think, during the questioning of Phil. Evolution is descent with modification. We all are quite convinced that this happened.
I'm not.
Darwinism, well, on my side of the table.
That's for sure. But I had a specific question.
I'm finishing. Darwinism, evolution by natural selection, is one of the ways by which evolution can take place. The argument that has been presented so frequently from your side of the table is that if all we have to do is disprove Darwinism and we disprove evolution. That's nonsense.
I'm trying to
another point. I will try to answer your question. I'm sorry.
Something factual and concrete, like a number.
Why do you assume that the fossils are the only source of data for evolution?
I certainly don't. You're absolutely right. But I'm talking about the whale, right? Large seagoing mammal. The thesis is that there's a Darwinian progression, and the evidence is 3 or 4 intermediates. I'm asking you to give us your best estimate of the number of changes required to take a dog-like mammal to a morphological, physiological. Just give us a number. Is it 3?
That's an absurd question.
Why?
None of us on the evolution side of this argument has ever proposed that we can come up with the number of changes.
Then how on earth can you commend the mechanism if you're unsure whether it's adequate to the result?
Why are you so fixated on the mechanism
because
of natural selection?
Because that's the heart of your doctrine. It's a theory. It's a scientific theory.
Would you agree with me that if you disprove evolution, if you disprove natural selection, you therefore disprove evolution?
Sure.
You're wrong.
Why?
Because natural selection is only a way by which evolution
there is no
place.
other
The evidence will still be there. From homology, from anatomical homologies, biochemical homologies, and the fossil record. We're not dependent on the fossil record.
Focus on my question. I'm begging you. We have a theory.
I answered it.
The theory is the theory of random mutation and natural selection. I'm asking you to apply it to the case of the progression from a dog-like mammal to a seagull.
I'm begging you not to. So. Thank you very much, Ms. Scott. Mr. Berlinsky. Mr. Berlinsky, you're up. And Mr. Berlinsky will question Professor Miller, and then Professor Miller will question Mr. Berlinsky.
Should I go first?
Yes.
Professor Miller, would you agree with the statement that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution? It's very often quoted.
The statement you're making is made by Theodosis Dobzhansky.
It's often attributed to Ernst Mayr also.
Fair enough. And in a simple way, so I don't have word games played on me. No, I would not agree with it. I think there are things in biology that are perfectly sensible, even if evolution is not correct. However, our understanding of the interrelationships between organisms, phylogeny, and natural history does indeed only make sense in light of evolution.
But in terms of your own very fine work in cell biology, evolutionary theory plays no role whatsoever.
Does evolutionary theory play a role in my work?
Proton transport.
Thank you for complimenting my work. The answer is no, that's not correct. The reason for that is a few years ago, an investigator discovered a very interesting microorganisms, a prokaryote called prochloron. Prochloron turned out to be the very first prokaryote, organism without a nucleus, discovered that had both chlorophyll A and B. This suggests very strongly that in an evolutionary sense, prochloron is the evolutionary ancestor of the chloroplasts of higher plants. This organism was sent to me because of the kind of structural work I do with the idea, let's put it to the test. Because what we did in my lab was to investigate the structure of its photosynthetic membranes, and lo and behold, we found that they were enormously similar to higher plant chloroplasts. If they had been dissimilar, it might have been an argument against evolution. It turned out not to be the case.
I'm persuaded that you have been invigorated by the shade of Charles Darwin. But the fact is that in your published scientific papers, the term evolution occurs as frequently as the term Presbyterian, which is to say not at all.
Well, I have to tell you once again, sir, you are wrong on the fact.
All right.
None of my 75 plus published referee papers uses the term Presbyterian. At least 3 of them use the term evolution.
I stand corrected.
The details
odds
matter.
75 to 3 against the usefulness of evolution in your own scientific life. Let's leave that question aside and let's pass to another one, since I don't see any way of resolving that particular issue.
I still reject it on the terms. You say evolution is not useful. The very reason why we study the translocation of proteins in lower organisms such as yeast is because we believe we learn something about how our own cells work by studying other organisms, and the underpinning assumption for that is, in fact, evolutionary biology.
That's nonsense, and you know it. You study it because it's an interesting and accessible question. That's the only
well, sir, the only thing I can tell you is if it really was nonsense, the significant sections I write in the end of my grant applications to the National Institutes of Health would no longer be successful.
Could well be. Let's turn to the question I so vainly tried to prompt an answer from Dr. Scott. How many morphological changes do you think were required to affect the transition those charts of yours were sent to document?
Okay, now I will give you a straight answer. And the straight answer is that when you look at 2 species that are separated by 5 million years of geological time, the number of changes must be very, very large.
Give us an estimate.
However, recent studies of speciation, and I'm sorry to pick this specific species, but it's relevant to your question. Recent studies of speciation in sunflowers have shown conclusively that a new species can be established in terms of a speciation isolation mechanism with as few as 10 genetic changes.
Yes,
that's your answer.
I've read the same science papers you have, but those are very close. A dog-like mammal and a whale are very far.
That's right, and the other end of the room is very far away, and it should not surprise you that I get there with 1 step at a time, and that's what we're
Can I conclude that you refuse? No matter the number I give you, you will neither assent nor disagree with the number. If I say there are 100,000 morphological changes required to take a dog-like mammal living on the land to a whale,
sorry, yes, I will answer that. That's way too high. We believe that organisms, well, I shouldn't say we believe. The good genetic evidence is that there are about 100,000 genes in a human being. I would best guess there's somewhat fewer in whales. What you're telling me is to change from one similar organism an organism that looks more like a whale than any terrestrial animal that has ever lived, to a whale that looks more like a terrestrial animal than every whale has ever lived, would require every gene to change.
No, I haven't even talked about genes.
No, you asked me for a number, and I said on that basis,
morphological change.
On that basis,
Changes to the
100,000 is too high.
All right, 50,000?
My turn. Okay. Now, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You have said again and again and again that transitions are missing. And I hope no one in the audience missed the fact that Dr. Scott pointed out that the transition from reptiles to mammals, and looking around the room, I see I'm surrounded by mammals. This should be a point of interest to us. That transition is exceedingly well documented. Now, once again, you said all the transitionals are missing, and I'm confused. If this transition is very well documented, how can you on the same face say they're all missing?
You know very well I didn't say that. I agree that the late reptile to mammal sequence is well documented. No question about it.
Okay, let me go a little further. Horses and elephants. I pick these organisms because they're large, because they're recently evolved, and because they are recent, we've got lots of fossils. They're easy to pick out. The fossil record of horses and elephants is extremely well documented. Now, you said at the other end of the table you deny that descent with modification is correct. So here's what I'd like to know.
I said I didn't believe
you said I'm not convinced by it. I don't. I believe, sir, you did.
I said I'm not convinced.
So here's my question. If not descent with modification, please tell me your explanation for the temporal appearance of these extremely closely related, in morphological terms, organisms over time.
Okay, 2 points. First of all, I neither affirmed nor denied descent with modification. I said I have no opinion. I don't happen to have an opinion on that issue. It's vexed, in my opinion. Second of all, you have chosen three, and the only three examples in the fossil record where there's a plausible Darwinian sequence. The dog-like mammal to whale sequence, the elephant sequence, and the horse.
Are you absolutely sure I can't pick up a fourth planet?
No, of course not. Each one is seriously questioned in the literature. The elephant
could you point out for the benefit of the audience what the question is? You said they're seriously questioned in the literature.
The question is, do we have a plausible sequence of morphological changes that lead to the late fossil form from the early fossil form by a route that makes morphological
and I would argue, yes, we do, and I hope you've read Bruce McFadden's marvelous book.
It's an excellent book, and it's an excellent book, and
he has put enormous effort into documenting those changes. So in legal terms, sir, case closed.
No, it's not closed. This isn't scientific argument. This is mere rhetoric. The horse sequence has proved vexed to everyone who looks at it, and the term of choice is that it's an astonishingly bushy sequence. We don't
Please explain the problem.
When you
waiting
for the answer.
When you look at what a bushy sequence is.
Yeah, this is a term occurred very often in the literature. When we look at the horse sequence, we have dozens and dozens of species entering the record suddenly and departing from the record suddenly, just as abruptly as they entered. We do not really know whether the modern horse has ancestral patterns with the dozens of other species that we find in the fossil record.
So what that means is that you hold open... Sure, go ahead.
If we look closely at some of the amazing structures, for example, we find it very difficult, we find it very difficult to find specific antecedents. The more we study such structures, the less plausible it is that they have an ancestral pattern.
Let me suggest to the audience that what Dr. Berlinsky just said is in fact not correct. And I can recommend articles and books in which you can find not only a series of transitional forms, but also good evolutionary morphologic explanations for it. And here's the question that I have for you. Once again, to someone who advocates, another question, to someone who advocates intelligent design.
I don't.
The fact, to someone who advocates intelligent design, does the sequence of these organisms in the fossil record simply mean that the intelligent designer was incompetent, he kept making things and they went extinct, or that he was restless, I try this, I'll try that, I'll try the other thing, or does it mean that in fact these organisms are related with by descent with modification?
No idea. I mean, it's not a question I'm prepared to answer one way or another. I don't see why I'm obliged to answer that. I'm coming here under the large tent of objurgation. I find scientific flaws with the Darwinian theory. I don't have a replacement.
Okay, the point that I think is extremely significant is in this case, one side argued from authentic evidence and the other side said it's not enough to convince me. And I think that's a good way to end the discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Buckley. Closing arguments. First, Barry Lynn closing for the opposition.
Well, I hope that our side at least has done what I promised we would do from the beginning, and that is we have asked for alternative explanations for evolution, and we have gotten none. What have we gotten? Well, we have Mr. Berlinsky, who has literally moments, seconds ago, said he doesn't really have an alternative. We asked Mr. Behe. He said, well, a lot of people would say it was God, but we're not quite sure, I'm not sure at least, whether he's prepared to say it's God with any sense of authority. Mr. Johnson says, well, I don't know about the biblical answers as an alternative. We'll work that out after we debunk evolution, which I think will be some time from now. We've made it clear that evolution is not a philosophy, it's not a religious idea, it's not an ideology, it's the best, indeed it's the only scientific explanation for the fact that there is change in the natural order. We asked about intelligent design and got, I think, the best answer from Mr. Behe. Mr. Behe has, of course, compared, like it or not, compared the extraordinary complexity of the human cell to the mouse trap. He said if we look at that mouse trap, it was created by a human. In fact, Mr. Miller improved on it, as you saw earlier tonight. Therefore, if that's complicated, then indeed the cell must also have been designed by an intelligence. And as I thought about it tonight, it's a little bit, we were all talking about nature analogies, it's a little bit like looking at a mole build a molehill. You say, that's very interesting. Then we walk out in the woods the next day and we notice a big mountain off in the distance. We say, good grief, that's enormously large. A really big mole must have built that. The truth of the matter is, it's not logical. We should be looking for different forces that result in different things. Your mousetrap was built by human hands because its components are inanimate objects. Cellular life is living, vibrant, breathing, changing matter. You're not just comparing apples to oranges, you're comparing plastic apples to organic oranges. And I think, therefore, this analogy fails. Let me close by saying, and speaking only for myself, because we do have a difference of religious opinion, I draw upon a scriptural passage which is dear to both Mr. Johnson and to myself. It comes from the first chapter of John's Gospel. It reads, "In the beginning was the Word." Indeed, that word just might turn out, literally, to have been a command. Evolve. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I compliment the negative on the way in which their arguments have been framed. What is it that we set out to say here? Namely that the notion of creation has not been invalidated by whatever loyalty is shown to the idea of evolution. That is to say, we have used the word intelligent design in order to reach for something that is not biblical in dimension, but nevertheless suggests that the miracles with which we are familiar are most probably miracles that didn't happen simply by chance. I think we all have reason to celebrate, in effect, the repudiation of materialist explanations that have been so studiously observed by eloquent adversaries. So let me just close by reading one paragraph from an essay written 20 years after Darwin. In 1864, there was a diocesan conference at Oxford. It chanced at this time to be in the neighborhood a man who was neither priest nor scientist, a man given to absurd freaks of intellectual charlatanry, yet showing at times also such marvelous and sudden penetration into the heart of things as would come only to genius. It was Disraeli. He began in his usual affected manner, slowly and rather pompously, as if he had nothing to say beyond the perfunctory platitudes, and then, turning to the presiding officer, he uttered one of his enigmatic and unforgettable epigrams. What is the question now placed before society? The question is this: is man an ape or an angel? I, my lord, am on the side of the angels. The audience, not kindly disposed to the speaker, applauded the words as a jest. They were carried the next day over the whole land by the newspapers. They have often been repeated as example of Disraeli's brilliant but empty wit. I suspect that beneath their surface glitter and hidden within their metaphor, these words contain a truth that shall someday break to pieces the new philosophy which Huxley spent his life so devotedly to establish.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. Well, I'm glad that's settled. I'd like to thank our debaters, and I'd like to thank Seton Hall University, and I'm not going to tax anyone with my voice any longer. I apologize for that. And I guess we'll know in a few million years who's right and who's wrong about this. Thank you very much.